I think most people on the show right now know about Dale. He needs no introduction. However, he's a retired school teacher. He lives in Harleysville, Pennsylvania, with his wife Susie. His fascination with trains began at the age of 4 in 1946, with trips with his grandfather to Philadelphia from Norristown, PA, behind Reading G-Class Pacifics. He also witnessed the Lehigh Valley transit trolleys running on Marley Street in Norristown, passing his grandfather's house. His parents reinforced his interest with visits to the Reading's Bridgeport Roundhouse and nearby Abrams Yard, as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad's Paoli station, where the evening parade of GG1 powered name trains put on quite a show in the mid-1950s. Dale has authored 4 hardcover books on the Reading Railroad, the Reading Diesels Volume 1 and 2, the Reading in the Conrail Era, Book 1 and 2. He also is the editor of 2 monthly columns in Railfests magazine, which are the Keystoner and the Seashore lines. He's had photos and articles published in Trains, Classic Trains, Railfan and Railroad, as well as local Railroad Historical Society publication. He has presented slide and now digital shows to community groups as well as Railroad Historical Societies. He is currently the director of the museum operations of the the Reading Railroad Historic Museum and Homburg, PA. He's a member of the Reading Company Technical and Historic Society, the Allegheny Railroad Historical Society, in the Philadelphia chapter of NRHS. That's quite a bio.
Thanks for the introduction, Alex. I know Alex has been after me for years to come down and do a program, but it's a little bit of a distance, and I really enjoy the Zoom presentation concept. The historical societies I'm a member of have their monthly meetings using Zoom, and what it's done is to provide a connection for people who, especially retired people who moved to Florida, who could never come to our society meetings. Well, now they can. And so I really like this format, and it's something that, unfortunately, I've gotten into digital, which has made it easier. And along with that, learned how to do PowerPoint and things like that. The screen you're looking at right now, I normally show only to community groups of one type or another who say, you like trains? Why do you like trains? And you're familiar with this. I mean, the basic thing is that if somebody's really not into it, you can't possibly explain it to them. But it comes down to these things, and you think about it, especially when you do photography, all the places you get to, you certainly learn about the weather and when to go out, when not to go out, and what fronts are, and so forth and so on. But it all comes down to just loving the hugeness, the power of trains, and just be trackside and witness that. And then, of course, the ever-changing scene, which you'll see in this program, there's always something new. And it's very refreshing to be in a hobby that is so interesting. Program tonight is called Pursuing the Reading, One Man's Obsession. My wife considers it an obsession. And you get to any location you can, and you get any kind of elevation you can. That's a Plymouth Voyager van that I had. Actually, that was shooting down in Virginia, come to think of it. And I've had a lot of opportunities being involved with the Historical Society of the Reading to be a part of actual equipment which has been preserved. This is the Reading as it looked in 1950. And it's about the time period we're going to start with. The Reading Railroad, of course, was created to haul coal from up around Pottsville down to Philadelphia, anthracite coal. And as the system grew in the 1800s, especially the 1870s, they began to lease and or purchase other smaller railroads. And so they ended up with a system like this that extended from Philadelphia over to almost New York City, all the way up to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, out here to Hagerstown, with a connection to the Western Maryland. And so it became a system that covered most of southeastern Pennsylvania. The early stopping grounds, yeah.
There's a little blue and white and blue box at the bottom of the screen. If you can hide that, that'd be great. If not, it's okay. That's good. Yeah, thanks.
All right, good. I owe Classic Trains magazine the origin of this map when I did my article on the Boy Scout Jamborees at Valley Forge, which was fascinating. I've never enjoyed doing research more than I did for that article. So they produced this map to give people an idea where this was and when the trains came into Valley Forge. I grew up in Norristown, which is 20 miles outside of Philadelphia. Here's the Schuylkill River, and you had the Pennsylvania Railroad on one side of the river. That's the Schuylkill Valley branch. And of course, the main line of the Reading on the other side of the river. You also had the Philadelphia Western Trolley, which still runs today under SEPTA down to 69th Street. And we lived in the west end of town. This is the Stony Creek branch that went up to Lansdale.
Because I'm chatting with my PG. He's just showing pictures.
And then we moved out to Betswood. That's just opposite Valley Forge Park, which was a state park in those days. So I spent a lot of time at first at Port Kennedy, which is a mile walk across the bridge over the river. And I enjoyed watching the trains there, but then I began to get Trains magazine and look at the photographs and think, wow, I'd like to do that myself. So you'll see I end up going down to Abrams Yard 3 miles away. Part of that was I could walk here when I was small. And then later on, I was allowed to ride my bike, which gave me an extended area to cover. And you'll see some shots too from Perkiomen Junction. The beginning for riding trains was with my grandfather from Norristown to Cobb Street, as Alex mentioned, behind those big Pacifics that the Reading had. And this is what a typical coach looked like. And this started in 1946. Usually every other week, he worked for the Inquirer in Philadelphia. And I was able to ride with him. But I didn't realize it, and I don't know why nobody in the family mentioned it for years and years, but I discovered this in the archives of our museum. There was a connection before I was born, and my great-grandfather's brother was a conductor on the Reading, Benjamin Woodland. This is what the Pacifics look like. This is one of the G2s at the Cobb Street. Now this one's going west. That over here is the Pennsylvania Railroad Schuylkill Valley branch, which was electrified up to Norristown for commuter trains. Now this train would be headed to Philadelphia. You still see the Pensy over here on this side. And these are the trains I would ride. And at 4 years old, to be honest with you, I was frightened when those things came rolling into the station, 80-inch drivers. And boy, I'll tell you, they rolled into the station and made a quick stop. So it was a huge machine. Something much, much bigger than I was at 4 years old. A few years, I was a little bit insane playing with trucks, but I certainly got over that quickly. And there's Port Kennedy Station, just at the edge of Valley Forge Park. Station's still there today. It's in very sad shape, but at least it's still there. And as I mentioned, I just go over in the summer and watch trains and actually started to keep notes. I wish I had been a little more specific, but at least I had identified the locomotives as road switcher or cab unit, not identifying it as an FA or an F7 or whatever, but I do have some of those notes. This is Port Kennedy, a westbound FA, AB set, and that's from the Betswood Bridge, which went across the Schuylkill. You're looking down toward Abrams, you're looking east down the Schuylkill River, and this is a 4-track main line from here, actually from Abrams Yard to Phoenixville. And then it became 2 or 3 tracks, depending upon the industries along the line. I should mention, too, that the station agent who was there was a really great person. As the old copies, were out of date with the guide, guide to trains in the United States, the schedules and everything, the official guide, he would give me the old copies. And oh boy, I would pore over those and began to find out there's a lot more than just the Reading and the Pensy. This is the very first camera I had. I think it was 127 film, 8 exposures, no advanced rapid lever kind of thing. And then in Abrams Yard, I took my first photograph. It's the very first one back in 1952, one of the relatively new Alco RS3 locomotives. At Abrams also, I had my first cab ride on number 510. So that was a thrill also. Now, I had seen steam locomotives up until about 1950, but again, not having a camera yet, I didn't get any photographs of those. This is one of the last orders are the Baldwin AS-16 switches of the Reading. The last 5 units had the high hood design. You see the cabooses were still red. And most every train, westbound or eastbound, would stop at the yard to pick up cars or to set out cars. So there's a pair of FTs. Notice the very little separation here because they were drawbarred together. They didn't have couplers. And there's one of the FAs again, an FAB set, stopping going west toward Reading. The signal bridge was a wonderful prop, and it lasted till about 1984 when Conrail took it down. There's the crew going over their set out orders, what cars go to what track. There was a yard office just to the right here. And this, over the years, I began to realize how rare this photograph was. This is one of the Reading's train masters, westbound train heading up to Reading, perhaps Pottsville, with a passenger train. And these things were really, really rare. The center cab Baldwin's RT 624s of the Pensy. They were the almost exclusive power for road power on that branch. And I can remember seeing Trains magazine and looking at the new F7s and the FAs on the Pensy, and you know, why can't we have those things on this branch? And never had them. But after a while, I realized this was the rare engine here. And I actually got a cab ride a couple times. I had a friend whose father worked in the tower at Norristown Yard for the Pensy. And they would take cuts of cars from the Schuylkill Valley branch up onto the Trenton cutoff. So I was able to ride that a couple of different times. This is the other place I frequented as a kid, Perkiomen Junction. It's called Junction because the Perkiomen branch goes off to the right here across the river and eventually up to Allentown. It was a very unique junction in that you had a ladder track all the way across all 4 tracks. And you also had a pocket track over here that for lots of years, passengers could detrain from a mainline train, walk across and get on a train to go up the Perkiomen branch, which lasted until 1956 as a mixed train, which is fascinating also. So that's why there's another track over here.
Dale, was Reading using semaphore signaling while you were a kid, or had they already switched to lights?
They had already switched. Yeah, they had already switched.
Okay.
This is what your typical train looked like that went up the branch. A lot of cement traffic from Allentown at that area down to Darby, south of Philadelphia. Usually an ABA set of F7s or F3s, sometimes FAs. And he is getting onto the branch to go across the river and then up following the Perkiomen Creek, eventually up to Allentown. As a subscriber to Trains magazine, I saw pictures that were panned. In other words, the camera followed the train itself, and you had a blurred background to give it that illusion of speed. Well, the little Brownie Holiday camera didn't quite do it, but that was my attempt at doing that at Port Kennedy. 1953 was a real change in my devotion to the Reading. I had a friend, I was lucky, I had a friend who lived across the street who was a year older than me in Betswood. And his family was up in Gordon, Pennsylvania, one of the big yard, not big yard, but engine terminals of the Reading. And in 1953, we paid a visit to visit his relatives. His uncle was a brakeman. His grandfather was an engineer. And so I went along. And this is a Bob Warner photograph of Reading Yard in 1953. And you see the T1s were still operating. They operated until 1956. There's one of the new Baldwin AS-16s. And this is a scene that, you know, I can vividly remember, but didn't have a camera to shoot. So we arrive at Gordon. That's what the old station looked like. There was a water tank there. And Gordon was the base of a grade, 4-mile grade up to Locust Summit. And that was one of the steeper grades on the Reading. We got there a week after the first trainmasters were delivered from Fairbanks Morse to the Reading. And I also had the opportunity, because my parents banked at Philadelphia National Bank in Norristown, and they helped finance this. So they gave out these little cards. It's like a 3-inch by 8-inch little card. On one side had a picture of what supposedly was a picture of a locomotive, which is obviously doctored because the Reading was not that size. You'll see it in a minute. And had silver trucks. but it had that on the front, and on the back had all the information, horsepower, weight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you could just grab as many as you wanted. So I still have them. But this is what 803 looked like when it was new. You can see the difference in the lettering, the handrail options. You had one that it dipped down here in the middle, which is what the Reading chose. You could have that locomotive with handrail. It did not dip. So in 1953, October, the engine was a week old. I had a ride in this trainmaster pushing a loaded anthracite coal train up to Locust Summit. And back in those days, you get to the top of the grade and they cut off on the fly. They didn't stop. Brakeman went out, pulled the pin from the walkway, and the train kept going. And then we stopped and backed down the grade. And then we got down to the bottom. They let us operate the locomotive in the yard. And that was it. I mean, I was forever and ever a rail fan. This happened over near Ambler, Fort Washington area of southeastern Pennsylvania. You're looking at the Pennsylvania Roads Trenton Cutoff, and that's the Reading's Bethlehem branch. And they had a little problem July 1956. It was a coal train. No, it wasn't coal. It was a mixed freight. It was going across this bridge, a truss bridge through truss, derailed, and the bridge collapsed onto the Reading's Bethlehem branch. Fortunately, it was a Sunday. There's a big space in the schedule for commuter trains, so there was no issue with damaging the train or people getting hurt or killed. And this is them beginning to clean it up. That's another view of it. Look in the background, if you see the brand new Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Those
And
steam
the
derricks,
rest of the
Dale?
scene- yeah.
Were those
Yeah.
steam derricks, the wrecking cranes?
Yes. Yep. This is the end of mainline steam. Again, having that connection to people up in Gordon. We got a phone call one night and they said the last T1 was going to go west out of Abrams. And while I didn't photograph it, we went over and watched it go through Port Kennedy, knowing it was the last one. This is what that would have looked like just a couple miles up the road at Perkiomen Junction. Boy Scout Jamboree, that was a thrill. And I was so happy to do that article for Classic Trains because the research was so much fun. I had seen a lot, but didn't really understand what was going on with all the detail. And so it's a pleasure to do that. This is a magazine put out by the Reading, the monthly magazine, lots of information, lots of good information for research and just to know what the railroad was all about. So this is on the cover of the issue in 1957, August. And for me, the official guide came alive. I looked at all those railroads and the maps and started to see Pictures and Trains magazine. And here I was, they were coming to me from all over the country. It was fascinating. Perkiomen Junction was where they turned the train. There's a Y in those days at Perkiomen Junction. And then they stored the coaches down at Woodland Yard, which is east of Conshohocken. The baggage cars were stored up here at Perkiomen Junction. And here we have Missouri Pacific coaches behind the CNJ Trainmaster. And I sprung for 2 rolls of color film. It was twice the cost of the black and white, but I knew there would be lots of color with what was coming. B&O E8s and B&O E7s at Perkiomen Junction. Fascinating. It's just never thought I'd see it close to home like that. This is a train that they operated over in New York City. They had daily trains for the scouts to visit the Statue of Liberty. And this is the pair that ran the whole time, an RS3 and a GP7 from the CNJ. They also had a trainmaster here. He's probably moving from one train to another. There was a walkway underneath the railroad here, which is because of that station I showed you. So that's from the walkway looking up. Diversions. Times that I was not active with the Reading. College, 4 years at Westchester State College in those days. And that was my 1957 Triumph TR3, which was a lot of fun, but wasn't in the greatest shape. And then I met my wife while we were in college. So time out for the car, the education, and my wife. During that time, of course, I basically missed the Iron Horse Rambles. And that's when the Reading became known nationwide. And fortunately, that's being recreated in a small way with the 2102 just about to come out into service. So was lucky to get slides from other people of that event. This is at Birdsboro going west when the old steel company was here. There's the little Camelback, which is now out in Ohio, but had been at Strasburg for a number of years, number 4. Bridgeport Roundhouse, I spent a lot of time watching trains there. Before they built the new bridge over the river, you could park and look down. There was a big water tank on the hill and see all the engines being turned and serviced. And of course, this is one of the rambles. Down in Delaware, a big horseshoe curve just above Wilmington. On the Wilmington and Northern branch, they were doing a photo run by. And during this time, the Reading received the first of its second generation diesels, the EMD GP30s. And with the GP30s came a new paint scheme. It had been kind of dull before with that solid green Pullman green paint scheme. But there's a whole story in this. I'm not going to go into it now because there's a lot else to talk about. But it's fascinating how this all came about, the paint scheme in particular. What a contrast. Everything was sort of black and white in those days with steam, and steam was nice, but sure wasn't colorful. These things really stood out. And that was the purpose of painting them like that really people would pay attention to it when they saw it go by. Got a job, my first job at Penridge South Junior High School in Perkiomen, PA, teaching social studies. And you can see the railroad right behind the school. And that was a really good, lucky thing. Here I had a classroom on this side of the building. And when the leaves were off during the winter time, it was the teacher looking out the window watching the trains go by and not the kids. This is the 1.1% grade up through the Perkiomen Tunnel. So when they came up here, they were making lots of noise. Then we also got an apartment in Lansdale, which is like 9 miles down the road. And with that apartment, lucked out again. We had the very end apartment. And so out the back window of the apartment, I could take pictures like this. Maybe cold and snowy and icy, and I was nice and warm, 70 degrees, taking pictures. This is a 12-inch storm right around Christmas. This is before I got my slide camera. And then, of course, once I got my slide camera, the images improved greatly. And that shows you where the apartment was. You have a deck in the front, so I can shoot trains this way, and then the windows in the back and shoot out the back. That's actually light engines coming back from delivering an ore train to Bethlehem. One of the Reading's U30C is leading. Another unusual movement. And here we have 3 RS3s. If you look at that, it's not limestone. It's a thing called prophyllite. And it's a material that was brought down to Philadelphia from Newfoundland by ship, unloaded at Port Richmond, and taken to the American Olean Company, which made tiles, ceramic tiles. And that train would run about 4 times a year, just as far as Lansdale, and drop the cars and head back to Philadelphia. Again, in the wintertime, comfortable shooting snow scenes. That's the rebuilt MUs the Reading had nicknamed Blue Liners. Maintenance train ballast being spread with a pair of SW1500s. You're looking north, the train slowly coming south. Switcher exchange and the needed maintenance, they would take the engines down to Erie Avenue in Philadelphia. So that's what you see there, one of the SW1500s and one of the rebuilt Baldwin switchers, which became an SW1200 basically. The overnight train from Philadelphia to Bethlehem usually went up the Stony Creek branch, which is right behind these buildings, and then up to Bethlehem, and then came back in the wee hours of the morning and left Bethlehem usually 3 a.m. And so you rarely saw that train except during holidays and or in the long, long days of summer. So here he is pretty early in the morning, but there is enough light coming south. You can see all 4 axle units. Iron ore train going north from the terrace in the front. A lot of times I do this show, people say, oh, look at this car, look at that car. But here's a nice lash up. Alco Centric 424, GEU30C, GP35, and a GP30 going north under the wires. There's another one of those late trains. This was the 4th of July weekend, and so the schedule was way off. And here he is going back to Philadelphia. And you see the big water tank in downtown Lansdale. The apartment was literally right along the tracks. Got lucky, visited South Modena, just south of Coatesville on the Wilmington and Northern. and there were several steel companies and scrappers there. And one day we went over, and here were the Reading train masters about to be cut up. And they still had their builder's plates, which was really a surprise. We didn't have any tools. So my friend and I drove into Coatesville. There's an old-fashioned Sears and Roebuck right on Main Street. We bought a set of wrenches and gave back out and helped ourselves to builder's plates. A couple of shop tours. As a teacher, I had a club that we called the Ferroeconology Club, which means study of the iron horse, which didn't make the other teachers too happy. They said, why don't you just call it a railroad club? But this was fun to call it that. And so I took the kids out in 1969 and again in 1972. And my email address is RSA, which is the class of this type of locomotive right there, 5302. Sad sight. 803 is right here in the deadline, about to go down to Modena and to be scrapped. That was during one of the tours. Quakertown in Eastern ran several trips in Eastern Pennsylvania. This is the Buffalo Creek and Gawley number 4, 280, which is still around, and had been actually been down to Spencer for a while, for a couple of years running out of there. But this made a circle trip down to Bethlehem Branch, and then out the main line, and then back down to Bethlehem Branch again. This is an odd train on display at Telford siding. Telford is right next to Souderton. Pennsylvania Power and Light had this exhibit train called the Energy of Man. And it was really to promote atomic power. So it would spend 3-4 days maybe in different towns along the Reading so people could tour. These are all ex-Reading coaches. Back to Abrams in the 1970s with a better camera. Number 621 is in our collection at the Railroad Museum out in Hamburg. And this is a train backing out of Abrams Yard. There was a train that ran every day that went out the Chester Valley branch, coming out of Bridgeport all the way out to Downingtown, although in later years it didn't go all the way out. So they had to back down out of Abrams about 3 miles to Bridgeport and then reverse and go out the single track line. Almost always had a pair of RS3s. This is one of the trains that came through the Abrams around 6:30 every night from Reading to Philadelphia. And when the multiple unit cars needed heavy work, heavy repair, and in this case, I think repainting, they would attack them on the end of a freight train. So that's what you're looking at here. He's heading back to the city to be put back into service on the electric lines. Again, you see what a great prop that single bridge made. The yard office is right over here. And nobody bothered you. You could go there as much as you wanted. This is a typical westbound train during the second generation diesel era. Around 5,500 horsepower satisfied the requirements for almost every train. So here you have GP30, Century 630, and that was roughly 5,500 horsepower.
What was on that flat car in the previous scene, Dale? Do you know?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what that was. Might have come from Lebanon. They had a big fabricating place. I'm trying to think of the name of the company that fabricated a lot of things like that. Now, this is interesting. This is the Plymouth Buck, they call it, a train that ran over the Plymouth branch, over toward Orland and a lot of limestone quarries. That was the only SW1500 to be painted green. And you'll see later on in the program why they had to repaint it. Sometimes you had 2 trains making set-outs at the same time. Both of these trains are eastbound. GP35 is all over the place. That was the most common of the second generation road switchers on the Reading. This is one of my favorite shots. 5210 is the highest numbered Alco Century 424, excuse me. And 5300 was the lowest number Century 630. And they're about to make a set-out on a beautiful October day. After the RS3s were retired, the SW1500s took over. The first batch had the switcher trucks. The second batch had the Flexicoil trucks. Now, the roundhouse of Bridgeport was replaced in 1964 by a small engine facility just to the west of the yard office in Abrams. So here you have a nice variety of power, one of the SW1500s, a GP35, a Century 424, and nicely finished off by a Reading boxcar. A friend of mine, Wilmer Hendricks, we took a lot of pictures together. So one day he's taking a picture of me, taking a picture, and I'm so glad he did. And that's what the picture was. And coincidentally, we just received this as part of our museum. Chessie donated that to us. It had been on the CSX system, as all the GP39-2s from the Reading were, and it's back home in Hamburg. Love the Reading terminal. Had its own smell, obviously their own sights. It goes back again to 1946 when they actually had little Camelback switchers working my first times down there. But it didn't change a whole lot over the years. It's another view looking out. One of the silver liners that came along in the 1960s. And that's looking back toward the head house. You have the MUs over here, the RDC cars here. In the 1970s, it was getting pretty obvious that the F units were on their last legs, especially the freight ones. They had all been retired by this time on the Reading, traded in on second generation power. So I made it a campaign to go out and shoot this particular train every night. It was very fortunate because this train went from Philadelphia to Reading in the evening, and then in the morning came back to Philadelphia, push-pull, so there's an engine on each end. But what was nice, this is train 7, westbound, it came through around 5 o'clock, roughly. And boy, you had perfect light at almost every station. It was just an easy thing to do, and you just spent a couple of weeks, picking your locations. There's Pottstown. That station's still there. And then had a chance to catch up with some Reading steam that I missed back in the 1960s with trips. This is on the CNJ over to Elizabeth, New Jersey and back in a nice snow, February snow. And then ride behind 2102 out to Hagerstown from Baltimore, Port Covington. And this is a photo run by Virginia Mills, west of Gettysburg. It was cold. And then in Hagerstown, a wonderful coincidence, they have talked about bringing the PAs down after they were retired and having some kind of excursion thing in West Virginia, which never panned out. But that day, the PAs were here and the 2102s. I never thought I'd get a picture like that. It was 15 degrees. We were out of the train for 4 hours and my feet felt like wooden blocks. Some interesting operations. Every time there was a transit strike in Philadelphia, the PTC, the Reading provided extra seats with longer trains for service within the city limits. And then, of course, that train, this particular one, went to West Trenton. What was unique is they didn't have enough MUs that were under power. They were either pulled out of a repair line at Wayne Junction Electric or were mechanically unable to power themselves. So they'd put a pair, in this case, GP35s on that train and go all the way out to West Trenton. It's really, really an unusual operation. And every 3 years, there was a strike. And so in 1974, they had a pair of the newer GP39-2s, same location at Jenkintown. As part of that operation too, the push-pull operated with an extra coach. And this is easy to do because the push-pull was sitting in the Reading terminal all day long from 8:30 to roughly 4:30. So it could be used elsewhere during that normal layover time. That's going out of Lansdale. Crossing the Route 202 bridge down at Gwynedd. Push-pull operation again. There were only 3 units left at this time, 900, 902, and 903. This is a Philly chapter trip that made a circle trip up and around through Bethlehem and out to Reading and back down to Philly. And the really interesting trains, and oh, I wish I had video in those days. The iron ore extras, 8,000-ton trains, 1.1% for 4 miles. I had to go through a tunnel over here to the left, and the sound was wonderful. 10, 15 miles an hour, slugging it out on the grade. And if you look at this lash up, there's 3 different models of Alco Sentries, the 430s, the 630, and 2 424s. Also, an interesting thing they did, they ordered their first 6-axle units, second generation 6-axle units in the around 1966, 67. And the Reading put them together in sets of 3 to test how well they would perform in relation to the advertising that said 3 engines could replace 5 of the first generation diesels. So the Reading wanted to find out if that was true. And for about 2 weeks, we had pure sets. In this case of U30s, we had pure sets of the first batch of Century 630s, the second batch, and the SD45s. So it was a great place to watch, photograph, and listen to trains. You'll notice the iron ore in this car. This comes out of Port Richmond, came from Venezuela, and it's 100 tons. 100 tons of coal would fill the car, but iron ore by volume is so much heavier. And so it looks like an empty train if you're standing on the ground other than looking at the springs. So that's why that car is the way it is. It's not an error, it's 100 tons.
Was
This
that
is the
previous
top of the
slide,
grade.
Dale, was that previous
Yeah.
slide with the red ore, was that the pre-taconite ore from Mesabi, you know?
It wasn't from Asabi, it was from Venezuela. It was pre-taconite.
Okay.
Now here's the top of the grade again at Rock Hill. Then we've got an all EMD lash up. And every third train or set of power would come back with empties. Most of the ore trains had 70 cars. When they brought the empties back, that was double, 140, 142 cars going back to Port Richmond. Now here you got a Century 630, Century 630, and a U30C. Sometimes they'd have to stop at Lansdale and wait for the commuter traffic ahead of them. So this was a parking lot which is no longer there. It's called the Madison parking lot in Lansdale. Telford Middle Track. This is a train waiting to go up the grade. There was an issue with a broken rail up the line a couple of miles. And this is one of the few places they could stop the whole train without blocking a crossing. You have all EMD power there. Some EMDs coming back from an ore train. Notice they built out windshield that was unique to the Reading. They built that out 11 inches to allow for 2 control stands. And here again, you see the whole train, 70 cars, sometimes 72. That's the top of the grade back there. He's heading toward Quakertown in this particular scene. And he starts to go downhill again to Quakertown. Sometimes the ore power would come back and pick up any merchandise from the siding here in Lansdale. And that's what you're looking at in this picture. That's the old power plant in Lansdale that used to receive coal. And of course, the local out of Lansdale was usually an end cab switcher. And this is toward the end of the Reading. This is one of the SW 1100s. 1100, yeah. SW 1001 in the nice green paint scheme. The shot of one of the RDCs hitting the snow that was plowed up at Reliance Road. This is only 2 blocks from my house. So I could just walk down and get these pictures without having to worry about trying to drive through deep snow. This is when SEPTA took over. And the reason it says no help is that when there were bad snowstorms, when it was still operated by the Reading, they would just assign freight engines, sometimes even ore power, and pull the thing along to break through all the drifts and then, be able to power through that stuff. But SEPTA didn't have any diesels at that point. This is early SEPTA. And so they had to go it alone. And this particular train's northbound at Telford Station, came in here and stopped and couldn't get started again because the snow was so deep. So he literally backed up about a quarter of a mile and gave it a running start and got through. This is another unusual train. This is at Coopersburg on a golf course on a Sunday morning. So I'm wearing my 3-piece suit. We're going to church and we had to cross a crossing in Souderton. And this thing came up upon the crossing. I thought, oh man, I got to get that. So I asked my wife if we could take the kids with the neighbor, and the neighbor agreed. So I took off. And in those days, when it was the Reading, you had to go above Quakertown to catch up to the darn thing. And here we have 20,000 horsepower. I've never seen more on any train in the Reading. 4 GP39-2s, SD45, Century 424, and 2 Century 424s pushing, which is why he stopped here. Because now it's all downhill to Bethlehem. The 424s at the back went to a place called Hilltop, literally the top of the grade. over the whole branch. And here you have this train, and as I say, strange looks. People are looking at me with a camera around my neck and a suit on, running over to take a picture of a train. This is a coincidence also. This is in Souderton. Every other Friday night, I go to the bank to cash the check. And just as I went across the crossing, I literally saw a big cloud of dust to the left. And here, the switcher had pushed the hopper cars through the farm viewer feed and grain facility too far. There's a relief train heading up to Bethlehem, I think it was going. This is up on the line of south of Quakertown. And that's a welded rail train coming out of the Telford middle track. If you get rail paste, there's pictures of that Telford middle track in this issue with the modern short lines that operate that. But there used to be a water tank here. And what they would do, the middle track allowed for a helper pocket. And they would put water in the tender if they needed it and push the 4 miles up to the top of the grade. And you'll see the other water tank, which is wood, is still standing there today. The metal one they tore down in 1972. This is a tunnel inspection car. The Perkiomen tunnel had a natural roof. And so from time to time, they had to inspect the rock and be sure there was nothing loose that would fall on a train. So they would push this through with a diesel, and the workers would ride up on that platform. Also, every summer, this is a weed spray train. Now, they don't do that anymore because of all the environmental things. But here you see the spray coming out. These are the tank cars carrying the weed killer, and it would smell for a good 2 weeks. Another unusual operation, the Philadelphia Phillies baseball specials ran for 2 or 3 years. Here you see a pair of GP30s with MU trailers. By this time, all the what they called steam coaches were done. They weren't operating anything other than the push-pull, and that wasn't big enough for this. Bethlehem Steel was the biggest company on the Reading, and so they said to the Reading, "We'd like to run a baseball special." And the Reading would say when. So they ran up the branch dead, picked up the people in Bethlehem, ran down the branch, came back up with the people, and then back down. So for a photographer, it was wonderful. This is about 8 cars, I think it was. This is another year. I didn't think they'd play the game, but by this time they had Veterans Stadium with the artificial turf, and so they did play the game. The weather wasn't the greatest for photography, but here's the MU being pushed back to the station, and there it is south of Sellersville, heading down toward Philadelphia. What they would do is run the train down to the North Broad Street subway station on Broad Street, and the people would get off the train, get on this chartered subway train, and go right down to Veterans Stadium, and then just reverse the process later. Sometimes the RDCs had to be worked on in the summer. Every year they had maintenance out in the Reading shops, so they would substitute the push-pull train. And as I mentioned, that laid over at the Reading terminal, so it was able to cover a schedule that would fit right into that time slot. 1979, there was a power outage. By this time, Conrail was the operator, but not all the engines had been totally painted blue. So here you have a train operating during that power outage. They had trouble with the substations at Wayne Junction. They just didn't supply enough power. And you'll see the pantographs are up, but that's for the air conditioning and the lights. So there was enough juice for that, but not enough to propel the train. Allentown, Bethlehem, I got to know that. It became a real favorite with all the traffic they had up there. This is just about to leave the yard to go west. And you have the 2 Century 630s, lowest number and highest number on the same train. There's the tower. It used to be CNJ, then it was taken over by the Lehigh Valley when CNJ left. Here's the light yard, and trains coming out and crossing over. You see the track maintenance in those days was getting to be less and less. Single GP, excuse me, U30C, GE, 61 cars. Bethlehem Engine Terminal was great. They never bothered you. You could walk all over and take all the pictures you wanted. And that was great for holidays, Christmas time, 4th of July, whatever, when the trains weren't running. You had this big coaling tower left over from the CNJ. And then, of course, the Lehigh Valley came in and took over operations in 1974. So if you shoot Reading and Lehigh Valley power together, and oddballs like this, the CNJ had leased these Norfolk and Western F units from the Wabash, actually. This is over at Saucon, which is the yard that fed Bethlehem Steel. Unusual combination, Century 424 and MP15, where they had 10 of those. That was the last of the technically yard switchers. This is a shot of that coal train they called the Star. Came off the Western Maryland and fed Bethlehem Steel bituminous coal. It's crossing the Lehigh River and crossing the Lehigh Valley Railroad as the main line. This is a flood control project they put in the 60s to literally put gates across here and protect the steel mill. This is a train that's empty, going back toward Hagerstown. GP30, SD45, there's the coke works back here. And toward the end of the Reading, for the last 2 years, this is pretty much the standard iron ore power. GP39 -2s in 5-unit sets. This is the west end of Allentown Yard. There's the Lehigh Canal. The old C&J L&S branch went up here. The yards to the right. And there was a big pile of cinders when I first started going up there. So this is pre-drone photography. Here's the big gas tank that was there in Allentown for many years. The PP&L headquarter building right here in the city of Allentown, crossing the Lehigh River. That's a local they called the East Penn Local. Had been the East Penn Railroad years and years ago. But he's working all the little businesses along this line between here and pretty much as far as Topton. There's the Star. They called it the Bethlehem Star. Is that you can set your watch by this freight train. You can go up there 11:30 every weekday, and here he is. Just, wonderful. This is coming out of the yard. This is a different angle from that same location. The canal is underneath this bridge. And this is another view of the East Penn Local out of Emmaus, when there were a lot of small industries and lots of side tracks in those days. This is Port Richmond in Philadelphia, also a place that we never had trouble getting in. And this is a kickback track. They would take the grain cars up to push them up under the grain elevator, dump the load out, and then the car would drift down. And instead of having to switch it around, there was what do you call that switch down here? But anyway, he would roll up here, spring switch, and then he would go back on a return track. This is at the yard itself. The SW1001s here were the higher numbers. And when you get to the west end of the Reading, they were the lower numbers. Huge, huge grain elevator. Perkiomen branch was on its last legs. I was really happy to get that picture. That's one of the ballast cleaning trains. That's when Phoenix Steel Company was still in operation. This is the platform for the Phoenixville station. Train is eastbound. That's looking at the train the same spot going west. And it becomes 2 tracks after this, and actually into the tunnel, it's only 1 track. This is the west end of the tunnel. This is Schuylkill River. So they cross the river and immediately go under the mountain and then come out the other side at Phoenixville. One of the 2 Century 430s. Rutherford, there's that push-pull train again in the evening. And as the F units started to wear out, they'd have to substitute freight power. And this is actually a year and a half into Conrail. The Reading GP40-2s were the last Reading engines to be CR'd. That's simply because they ran that ore train over to pick up the ore at Joanna, go up to Bethlehem and back and back and back and back. And so they never got to painting them toward, in the beginning. It took a year and a half to get them painted. But interesting to see a GP40-2 on a passenger train. This is Reading, the shop area. Here you have what was the standard power for years on the Joanna ore trains. Look at the rust color from the iron ore dust. And then they were replaced in 1974 by the GP40-2s. And there's one of the push-pull units at Reading shops. Reading shops, as I said, I got a couple of tours. This is an RS3 being worked on. That's a GP35 that was wrecked over in New Jersey. And this is at the west side of Reading, West Reading itself, why I'm missing. It's coming up the track here from the connection either to Allentown or to Philadelphia. And this was the main line that went right over the Schuylkill into the city of Reading. Same location, but newer power. And this is the westbound train, again, one of those stars, eastbound, excuse me, you're looking west, coming down to connection that made a big Y connection there. This is a local, and you'll notice the locomotive is in between the freight cars, and that's so he could work sidings that were either direction. This is the track that connects up to the Lebanon Valley to go west. Here's the other side of the Y, connecting the Lebanon Valley to the line that went over to Allentown, and that's the Schuylkill River on the right. Wellington and Northern branch started right here at Birdsboro. See a small little yard they had. They had a tower. They also, this is a passenger station right here. And you can hardly see it, but it's a track here that goes off, connects to the Wilmington Northern, and there's the other track. So that made a big, big Y. What he's doing there, believe it or not, is shoving back. Those cars have ore, but it came from Cornwall. So they're taking it down to Joanna to be pelletized. There he is crossing the river, consecutively numbered GP 40-2s. And that's in Birdsboro itself, a huge steel plant they had there for years. No longer there. That's what the mine looked like. This is down near Morgantown, Pennsylvania, on the Wilmington and Northern. A separate little branch went back there. This is the Grace mine, which, you know, is gone now. This is along the Wilmington and Northern, what they call a switcher exchange. These are switchers that have been working at Coatesville during the week. And then you go up to Reading for some maintenance, light maintenance, and come back to Coatesville. And that's what you're looking at. West end of the Reading, this is Lebanon. See a nice variety of little switchers here. There's a rebuilt Baldwin, one of these SW1200s, and green and yellow, another rebuilt engine. This was where the Cornwall Railroad joined the Reading, and the Cornwall, of course, went down to the huge iron ore pit, which actually started in colonial times. Rutherford, the big yard, the biggest yard of the Reading. This is back in the day when the Western Maryland, of course, came in there from time to time. Look at the low numbers on the SW1001s. A nice combination here with the Century 424, and there was the car shops at one time. Another coal train off the Western Maryland. These are eastbound. This is an engine that was a trimmer, which, you know, attached cabooses to trains or pick up a car that was humped wrong. This is one of the GP7s that were for passenger service. They did not have dynamic brakes. So it's pretty obvious here. There's no blister up there. They also had steam generators back when they pulled passenger trains. And this is the only one of those painted green and yellow. Now, this is a picture I took just to get the engines, but when I got it back, I looked at this. It looks like a huge 1-inch scale model sitting on the edge of the gondola. Harrisburg, that was always a good place too. This is the old Penn shops, Penn Central shops, beginning of Amtrak. There's a cinder pile here also, and a little slag heap that Harrisburg Steel sent out a little critter now and then. Hagerstown, heading up toward Rutherford. And then Conrail. And of course, the variety of paint schemes was fantastic. That's in Allentown, the bottoms of Bethlehem, on what was the Lehigh Valley. That was the Union Station for the Lehigh Valley and the Reading. And this was really neat for a while. We started up to Binghamton. It was a 3-hour trip from Souderton. And here I am 2 blocks away from the Erie-Lackawanna now. In the early years of Conrail, of course, nothing was renumbered, not for a while. And so here I had these engines that I had driven 3 hours to photograph right in my backyard. Iron ore train. CNJ's Red Baron on one of the ore trains. This most of the Conrail trains, believe it or not, I'd say 1 out of 3 stalled on that grade up through Perkiomen. Here's the train that stalled. The Penn Central power was pure junk. They just, they would break the train in 2 to take half of it up, come back for the other half. That's how they did it. That hardly ever happened with a Reading. The Reading ran a Port Richmond to Bethlehem train in 4 hours, up and back. Well, that never happened with Conrail. Well, the ex-Reading GP 40-2s and Penn Central junk. And finally, of course, they got around to painting most everything blue. So here we are with ore jennies. There were never any ore jennies on the Reading. but they were now with Conrail. They're former Pennsy, most of them, Penn Central. The quarry at Rock Hill produced a lot of ballast. Here we have 4 ex-Reading SW1500s. One of them is painted blue. The others have not gotten their paint yet. This is the old station in Telford. And this was a treat too. This is a detour train. This train usually ran out through Reading over to Allentown and then up to on the D&H. But this particular day, there was a wreck out at Macungie, I believe. And so the train had to detour up the Bethlehem branch. The Bethlehem branch was half the distance from Philadelphia to Allentown as it was going out to Reading and back. But it didn't have the grades when you went out toward Reading that this line had, and you don't have commuter trains on that other line either. So they're the factors that even though it was a shorter trip, they didn't use that. Little accident in Souderton, dimensional lumber fell off one of those bulkhead cars. This is the water tank I mentioned. It's still there in 2022. And the reason for its longevity is that the quarry that operated there from time to time maintained it. This is back in the Conrail days. DP-15s were pretty common. That's the old Telford freight station. And being a teacher, we had some nice weather for photography and living as close to the tracks as I did, I could take advantage of that. These are renumbered into the 4300 series for SEPTA, actually Conrail, but not repainted yet. It's a Darwin Award winner. Fortunately, the police were able to notify the dispatcher and there weren't any incidents. This is a set of MUs that were retired by the Reading, SEPTA actually at this point, and they were being taken up to Wilkes-Barre to be made into a motel. So this is the top of the grade at Rock Hill, if you see the Penn Central Jeeps. And that was the motel. All that's gone. The cars are scrapped. They just refinished the station, by the way. It's beautiful. SEPTA. Push-pull equipment, painted it red, white, and blue. Some people call it the circus train. This is at Telford. These are the ex-Reading FP7s. That's Phoenixville. There's the station, French Creek, and he's going westbound, and half a mile he'll go into the Phoenixville Tunnel. Norristown, again, they kept the same schedule. So mornings and evenings, the sun was exactly where you would want it to be as a photographer. That's crossing the Schuylkill into Norristown. That's an old Philadelphia Electric Power Plant on Barbados Island in Norristown. That's the new Route 202 bridge. Freedom Train, Abrams Yard, early morning. There he is crossing the Schuylkill on the Falls Bridge, Fairmount Park in Philly. And then, of course, that same engine, 2101, was sent to Salcombe Creek and remade as the Chessie Steam Special. And there he is coming south from Bethlehem, past, again, Moyer and Son, Southern, 2 blocks from my house. Then we chased it. There he is going over 202, going down the Bethlehem branch. And here's in Fairmount Park, coming over the B&O Bridge, they called that, or the Blue Line Bridge. That was a connection built by the B&O for the passenger trains from Washington to New York. This is coming out from under the Art Museum. There's a tunnel off to the right here. And this is another tunnel, technically, a Gray's Ferry it's called, on the east side of Philadelphia, which is East Side Yard. One of the trips they did out to Gettysburg, it's the only time in those days I was able to get 3 live steam engines sitting next to each other. And then in 1985, the 2102 came home for some trips. Didn't leave home because Andy Muller purchased it, but the outfit from Ohio went belly up, and so he was able to take advantage of that. And they ran a bunch of trips, and now I can finally shoot 2100 series on the Reading, having missed the Iron Horse Rambles. This is the infamous 22-hour trip to Jim Thorpe and back, where the fire company, I think it was Lehigh, put fire retardant water in the tender. And guess what? This is one of those trips at Beltline Junction in Reading, going around the shops. This is Conrail era. You can see that here. There's the footbridge, which made an excellent place to take pictures. Crossing the Schuylkill east of Reading on the Beltline. And then in 1986, by now our society was getting some equipment. Conrail donated a GP30, which is the very first GP30 ever built. And then it was fixed up and repainted, and here it is on its debut in 1986 at the Reading shops. We had hoped to have that for our museum, but the city wanted to have a commercial operator take it over. Lots of neat poses here. That's a privately owned E8, which is no longer on, was the Blue Mountain in Reading. There's the 2102, and here's the 1554, which is still up on the DL. Little change of scene with 425 now, and the 2102 and the Reading's 5513. Made a great background. And here's the two engines that belong to our society, having been fixed up. 5513 first, and then the 5308 Alco Century 630. There it was, having just been painted in the Reading shops. Politics came into excursion trains that I helped arrange for the 100th anniversary of the borough of Souderton in 1987. It's the view from the cab of the 5513. SEPTA put out at this point, the track wasn't in the greatest shape. A lot of neglected maintenance through Conrail. Here, running down eastbound down through the Perkiomen Tunnel, single track, had been two tracks when it was built. A Sandy Muller's private car in those days, sitting at the Souderton station. We brought the 5513 over because the runaround track in Quakertown wasn't very good, so they didn't trust using that. So the 425 pulled the trains from Souderton to Quakertown north, and the 5513 pulled them south. There's a night photo session we did on our own. And had a chance to ride the 5308 a couple times on what was the Pennsy-Schuylkill Valley branch north of Reading. 1991, North Bend Railroad Days, the United Way sponsored that big placard on the front, which people objected to, and I understand that, but it paved the way to get the engine here. Track wasn't any good anymore either, so they did operate to Telford without the steam engine, but the Reading GP30 on this point. And for a 50th birthday party, I chartered a train on the Blue Mountain in Reading in those days. The 5513 was the power. That was just a couple years ago. Unusual things on the Bethlehem branch. To qualify a dispatcher, even though they didn't use the track, SEPTA used this SW1200 of theirs to run up to Quakertown and back. And this is interesting too. They were thinking about, this is under David Gunn's administration at SEPTA, getting, and he actually was able to get government money for this to get AEM 27s, A23s, excuse me. And here it is being tested in Lansdale with the old MUs. Everybody's got the pantographs up. And it actually didn't have such good luck coming out of the tunnel, commuter tunnel that they built, because it really slipped a lot, but they still bought them. Railworks was a project to rebuild the main stem of the throat of the system for SEPTA down to the Reading Terminal area. And so they leased some New Jersey Transit U34CHs. This is one of the one in disco paint scheme of the SEPTA coaches into Lansdale. NRHS had a convention in Lancaster, and they ran trips on the Reading and Northern. That's what you see here at Port Clinton. And then Andy Muller had the 1991 Railfan Days for 2 days using our equipment. The two locomotives are part of the Reading Tech. This is well, it seems to be a freight train, but it's a mixed train. There's a coaches back here, but that's at Tamaqua. And if you've ever tried to climb a silt pile, you know what happens to your shoes. It's hard to get up there, it keeps sliding away on you. But here it is, South Tamaqua. There's you can see the coach there, but the pair of Reading engines belonging to us heading up through Tamaqua. And hopefully they'll see this again. 2102 is coming down grade. They're just about to go around that corner of South Tamaqua. That pile's gone, by the way. They ran some trips out of Hoboken to Port Jervis with the 2102 and its bicentennial paint scheme that Blue Mountain Reading put on it, and the 5308 went along to guarantee power. This is at Leesport, where we had our museum before moving to Hamburg. Excursion trains that ran on the bridge. This is from the cab of the GP30. They did use the 5308 for a couple years on the Blue Mountain in Reading. This is the South Hamburg stop, just by Route 61. Philly chapter in 2001 ran FP7 trips. This is at Jenkintown. That's at East Falls, crossing the Wissahickon Creek. You can see the RL1 along for train light and so forth. Philly chapter at least 2 trips out to Strasburg. So that's what you see here, Groff's Grove. And then in 2007, I was able to help the Upper Perkiomen Chamber of Commerce celebrate their anniversary. And these are the FP7s going up to the Perkiomen area and operating out of East Greenville. Now, this is a disappointment. I thought the first trips were in fog in the morning, but it makes a moody shot. So there were trips both days. And, I didn't mind that. This is up by Veracruz. There's a man up there who owns this Reading caboose, which had been painted Conrail, and it's being put back into Reading. The southbound train right there with the excursion. Dillingerville Tunnel on the Perkiomen branch. And this water tank base is still there. Brick tank at Powder Valley, Pennsylvania. That's the end of the Perkiomen branch in those days. So the Reading actually cut that off in 1974. So it just goes from here up to Emmaus Junction, which connects to now Norfolk Southern. But the station is still there. We did some impromptu night photo sessions on our own. And of course, they ran some trips out of Scranton for one of the Railfests up there in 2010. And the Central or United Railway Historical Society owns this former Reading RS3. Naywald Tunnel, trains coming back towards Scranton from Stroudsburg. Goldsboro Station, and the Reading starts to fade away. It took them a long time to knock down the coaling tower because it was all reinforced concrete. The turntable here belongs to us. It's at our society. This is Saucon Creek Engine Terminal at the north end of the Bethlehem branch. Former Birdsboro Tower, torn down by Conrail. Excuse me, Norfolk Southern, that would have been. That's an eastbound train on the main line. Siding at Macungie, just to show how they kind of let things go before they remove the rail. Now, this is one of those ore trains going down to Joanna, but that line was torn up. And so for a few years, there was nothing there. But that's been rebuilt now for the Haynes and Kibblehouse Quarry. These are the books I have authored, and Alex mentioned that before. Some of the magazine articles I've done, Railfests, of course, a lot. And then I was thrilled to have the issue on the Reading Alcos a couple years ago for Railfan and Railroad. HO scale, I did some of it, more just to run trains rather than scenery. And of course, it's pretty much all Reading. For a while, I also had a G scale layout in the backyard. They take a lot of maintenance. I was fortunate to get some of Bob Wander's collection. He really got some great pictures in the early 1950s. And Wilmer Hendricks's collection, excuse me. The Western Maryland FAs at Abrams. This is up near Sunbury. Tamaqua. Ed Weller, fortunate to get a lot of his things too. That's that steam trip out of Baltimore to Hagerstown where the FAs put on, walking over Jackson Mountain. And here you have the original Reading, and there's the B&O Blue Line connecting in Fairmount Park, looking east. For about 4 months, the Reading leased Western Maryland FAs. That's at Port Richmond. And there's one of the trailer trains down near Fern Rock with the E30C. That's the one in our collection, 6300. Here's what happened to that 2763, which is why they repainted it green. And it's surprising they even bothered to rebuild it. This is one of the grain hoppers that got away and struck this locomotive. Fortunately, the crew jumped off before it hit. They could see it coming and practically destroyed the engine, but they rebuilt it. Today, you still have some evidence of the Reading, especially if you look at the Reading and Northern Railroad. These GP30s, they call them GP39RNs, are exactly what the Reading would have looked like had they kept their GP30s and survived past Conrail. But you have that diamond emblem and the anthracite carrier, even the identification of the unit, just like the Reading used to do it. So that's your modern Reading. That's a reproduction of that picture from Abrams. Lycoming Valley also has several locomotives painted in the green and yellow. SMS over in Bridgeport, New Jersey, influenced by the Reading. And as I said, my current pursuit is the Railroad Museum up in Hamburg. We've done a lot for an all-volunteer organization. This is an old steel foundry building. This is the office section that we put into an orientation room to show films and things. The little engine we have on a 1953 Ford chassis looks like a camelback. It's very close to the design and has smoke if you want it, and the whistle and the whole bit. We use that in parades. That's the interior of the museum. We had an artist paint a mural on the side of the building to spruce it up. And in 2017, we had a Railfest, night photo sessions. Repainted the 6300. We're very fortunate to have those. The SD45 got away. The irony is there were more EMD locomotives than any other manufacturer, but we do have a GE and we do have a Alco. Most recent acquisition within the last year from CSX, the 3412 that you saw earlier in Reading pictures on the old Pensy Schuylkill branch, which is has a signal bridge that doesn't work, but that was brought over from Birdsboro for the Blue Mountain Reading. This is an engine that we got back from California, one of the Reading's SW1200s, Stockton Terminal. And that's our little NW2, excuse me. And another reminder of the Reading is the Heritage Unit Fleet. And I couldn't believe it when that happened. They actually contacted us when they were thinking about doing it. And I talked to the one official and he says, we're thinking about doing this. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that man's getting paid to talk to me about their thinking about doing this. And I was thrilled that they did that. I never thought I'd see a modern day Reading engine. And they did a good job as far as, you have to look hard to see where it says NS. It really looks Reading. What was that, 103-degree heat, I think. That's a picture of it down there, Wilmington. And I had an x-ray taken and found out, oh, that's why I like Trek so much. Love to have that picture. That was my #1 target. Grew up there, watched trains here. The station's still there, and we've got the Reading again. And of course, that doesn't need a caption. This is out of Allentown and Emmaus, Perkiomen Junction. Same train. I put a lot of miles in my car the first year the Heritage units were out. Pottstown Station still says Reading Company, westbound. This is out at Wyomissing, where the lines come together from in the city of Reading and around it. Fleetwood, they've done a nice job restoring that. Sinking Springs, a great location for photographs. Down to Philadelphia, Schuylkill Expressway's up here. This is the West Falls Yard. There's Route 1 back here. And Abrams, there they are. This is odd because Reading never ever serviced 6-axle units here. But Norfolk Southern and Conrail, it didn't matter. Mertztown Station is about to be moved from alongside the railroad, but it's being preserved. And here it is on the Reading and Northern. And this is interesting. These are ex-Reading RDC cars. Reading-inspired paint scheme on the SW1500 and the Heritage unit. That tank makes a great photo prop too. It's been there forever at Sinking Spring. Warrensville Station, like a lot of other stations, former Reading stations have been preserved either by historical groups or whatever. And there he is coming up the grade to get back on the Lebanon Valley branch, and that's it.
Thank you, Dale. That was great.
Dale, is anthracite still being mined up there? Reading's associated with it. Is it still being mined? You know?
It is. Oh, yeah. A lot of it's for export. In fact, almost all of it's for export, but there is some, believe it or not, it's used in some paints. It's used in water filtration. And from time to time, a couple years ago, they had a big contract with some part of Russia that was sent out. So yeah, it's still being mined. It's all surface stuff, there's no underground stuff, but yeah, it's fascinating. It really is.